By stressing the undecidability of textual meaning and the instability of such important categories as the self, truth, the center, etc., post-structuralism undermines any and all theoretical systems that are totalitarian that claim to be universal. By emphasizing the indeterminacy of texts, deconstruction dismantles the binary oppositions of formal and/or structuralist thought and institutes in their place non-hierarchical plurality or the free play of meanings. Sorry. Now we turn to poetry. So I leave criticism behind, but I'll be able to synthesize things, hopefully in the end. In the history of modern poetry, complexity has long been considered a virtue, since the time of the Romantics to be precise. The ideal of uniformity or standardization derived from Enlightenment science gave way to the ideal of diversity that was much prized in Romanticism. In the 20th century, complexity became a desirable quality in literary compositions, functioning particularly in the lyric form as the norm. The poem itself was understood to be a composite of different and interrelated parts: syntax, diction, style, imagery, rhythm, argument, narrative, etc. In the present scheme of literary things, poetry's complexity has been understood as a matter of semantic richness, the multiplicity of its meanings deriving from the ability of its figurative language and the complexity of its form to hyper-semanticize themselves and generate ambiguity, which is to say, a wealth of interpretations. Across the centuries, poetic critics have identified the poetic devices that most commonly bring this density of meaning about: irony, allusion, symbol, repetition, fragmentation, and of course, paradox. That is the word that will reconcile deconstruction and poetry, actually. In poetry, complexity is primarily an offshoot of the semantic operations of paradox, which is the complex unity, the reconciliation of irreducible differences that the poem, being metaphorical, routinely performs. The effect of poetry itself demonstrates paradox, at once dulce et utile, which is to say, at once instructive and delightful, which represent the polar concerns of virtually all poetic theories across the centuries. The form of poetry can be explained in terms of a poem's story, sound, and image, and the content or insight of poetry is its significance, originating from the poem's objective situation, which is particular, but which metaphorically evokes a general or more universal intuition. Thus, the paradox of poetic insight is that it is necessarily embodied. The poetic image itself contains or is the statement. The poetic image, in fact, isn't just itself. It stands. It is a metaphor for something else. In poetry, a metaphor posits a resemblance between two unlike things, establishing their literal difference while at the same time transforming them figuratively into each other. Thus, the image-turned-metaphor reveals the paradox that in poetry, the literal can become the figurative, and form is nothing if not realized content. Paradox in poetry is a compositional procedure, while in deconstruction it is an analytical concern. In poetry, the appreciation of paradox lies in its being reconciled or unified by and in the poem's language, while in deconstruction it is recognized and understood as an indication of the text's undecidable meaning. A paradox is a statement that is itself self-contradictory, containing two claims that are equally true and yet cannot both be true at the same time. Can a person be both body and spirit? Can love be both liberating and constraining? Can light be both particle and wave? Can poetry be both form and content? It might help to recall that oxymorons are in fact paradoxes in shorthand form. As a unifying of difference, as a harmonizing of incongruity, a paradox, like an oxymoron, generates unexpected significance and offhand truth, which is irreducible to either of its original terms. I'm seeing parallels between the talks before and this one. If you've been paying attention, actually, we're more or less talking about the same thing. Poetry has been defined as the completest mode of utterance, and it is able to do this through the ironies and displacements of its semantic units, words, lines, stanzas, etc., that together produce the textual effect of paradox. Of course, aside from being the consequence of these formal features, meaning in poetry is finally a matter of interpretation, an activity that, by necessity, implicates considerations of the poet's possible intention, as well as the situation that frames both its writing and its reading. The intensive manifold that reality is said to be is uniquely approachable through poetry, which, like the world itself, is an ambiguous flux of interpenetrated elements unseizable by the intellect. That quote comes from a poet, of course. A flux of interpenetrated elements unseizable by the intellect, except complexity theory wants to seize it. The textual demonstration of this complexity is nothing if not difference, or in poetry's paradoxical case, self-difference, and flagging it is what, among other things, the interpretive procedure of deconstruction seeks to accomplish. Allow me now to moot my presentation by reading a poem whose nature as a paradoxical experience means that it cannot really be represented, least of all replaced, by even the most careful and critically astute analytic attempts to decompose it. You cannot quite replace poetry with a commentary of what it is. You just have to experience it. And I think that is a contribution of the humanities in the university, is that we don't have to produce research. We just have to produce the art, which is already itself an irreplaceable thing. This poem is the first in a 7-poem sequence titled Gift, proffered by the same lyric speaker who sees in the ocean a figure for the boundlessness of desire, herein bound by little else than language. This poem's utterance is being spurred by the sea's own oscillating gestures of tenderness and cruelty, and by the lyric self's realization of its permeability to the other, and therefore of its own impossibility. If we are permeable to each other, then we are actually impossible as entities, because we're all one. Gift. The rhythm that hears me this day is the sea's, salt-born, choking with weed and oysters, the movement of Piscean shapes weaving water far as the eye can see. And I am back amid the repeating waves of Pamilakan. The vessel bearing me is little else but desire, a density much heavier than our earth's liquid nature. Its only choice is to float. It is not stillness I am seeking from this ocean, but its pain. A violence of forms in the sweep of appearances, flashes of fish flying, herons and somersaulting terns, the handsome heads of cetaceans rising from abyssal depths, even the glint of shark fins slicing the horizon like quick knives. Life caught in the maw of its own consumption, permeable, as though we all are designed to pass through each other like food, plankton sifting into the fine-toothed comb of baleen, sunlight rippling past riptides to reach the sightless bottom of rock. And you are everywhere, even as you are nowhere in sight, for here is the place things cherished are laid bare in, the edge of bodies knowing, the edge of the world. And I know my task for the day is no different from the tides, to take in and let go, to push against land and pull away, to love you without claims. For nothing given is ever owned, and ghosts we already are of fickle matters imaginings. I told you I am yours for the kill, I can never take it back. Let this gift pass through the self's fictive openings, allow it brief residence someplace in the soul. True, not even the sea can hold us, but listen, its real bequest is not loss, it is transformation. Glass fished out from among a shore's brittle ruins is never quite glass, but a muted shard of water, all the ocean pressed against the palm. An empty shell, a grainy piece of coral. The gift is yours to keep or not to. I can no more reclaim it than the sea disown its salt. For love, how do you unbreathe a breath? I hope to suggest with this humble piece that the value of poetry, of art in a complicated university like ours is precisely in its being able to create and provide knowledge of human complexity, experienced not merely as the real, but rather as the true, which is to say, as art's precious and transfigured vision, also called illumination. Allow me to summarize some well-known criticisms, mostly post-structuralist and Marxist, against positivism, which arguably underwrites complexity theory as it has been described thus far. Positivism's privileging of science as the only true source of knowledge reduces the entirety of the human question to discrete and measurable quantities. For example, social activities are nothing but neural events, life itself is reducible to physical systems, etc., forgetting that whatever patterns or facts science may discover about the social world, these are far from objective and are ultimately interested categories that derive from the workings of subjective consciousness, which is always already culturally constructed and historically mediated. In other words, positivism fails to account for the role of the observer in constructing the reality he or she supposedly simply records. In equating social reality with the scientific explanation of natural reality, positivism also reifies or thingifies by turning abstract and static the lives of human beings. By assuming that facts exist a priori to any subjective conceptualizing of them, positive thoughts fail to understand how the very formation of those facts is an act of consciousness. Hence, positivism makes a ruinous assumption that the world is objectively knowable. As a conceptual move, this serves to eradicate subjectivity, even as in most cases the object being positivistically studied pertains precisely to various subjective states that exist within persons. We must remember that the very act of equating social reality with scientific abstractions like numbers is itself a form of value judgment, and that even as positivists appear to set out to explain the social world, most of the time what they are really doing is merely accepting, endorsing even, the existing relations of production. I told you this is Marxist criticism. It's a very old one from Horkheimer. I'm not originating any of this. It is ever the case that facts emerge out of a theory, and because positivists are not interested in examining their own scientific assumptions, for this kind of theoretical interest would obviously confound the very thing they are trying to perform, they cannot even see that the distinction they make between value and fact is itself already a value-laden act, and that the social world is not a given fact of nature, but rather a historical construction or a product of historical labor by historically situated individuals. Needless to say, the history that positivist accounts exclude is so pervasive as a constitutive force that it constructs even the very ways we perceive the world and its state of factual things. And so we may conclude that positivism merely describes facts in order to ultimately maintain them, while a more critical form of sociology views facts and reality itself as historical constructions. Implicit in this theoretical understanding is the anticipatory hope that the forces governing these facts can be willfully wielded in order to change the world for the better. In this sense, critical sociology studies human society in order to examine and take to task the forces of oppression and imperialism and become an ethico-political practice that will fight for the dignity of human beings all over the world. Social scientists cannot just stand idly by and allow their discipline to become an academic extension of repressive state apparatuses. The very claim that society can be objectively represented at all clearly runs the risk of endorsing it as it currently exists, which basically means foregoing critique in favor of maintaining the status quo. Simply put, because positivism's interest is merely to arrive at a description of reality, it lacks the radical edge that contemporary theory, represented for example by Marxism and post-structuralism, frankly professes and deploys. Finally, I just want to say that as I understand it, what happened was while I was invited to take part, I did a lot of research on complexity theory, and I discovered that there are voices within the movement that actually have an alternative opinion to the mainstream. And one of them comes from the Nobelist Ilya Prigogine. So I want to say that at the heart of complexity theory is the paradox of a determined but unknowable reality or universe. The ruminations of the Nobelist and physical chemist Ilya Prigogine, invoking the relativistic measurements of nuclear and quantum physics that practically dissolve the subject-object binary upon which the hard sciences rest, conclude precisely with the idea that it is philosophical and creative perspectives that can best approach this paradox. As Prigogine has himself eloquently conceded, without an epistemology of certainty, complexity theorists have no choice but to embrace the paradoxical and the uncertain, which to Prigogine's mind is what the various people in the humanities are already in fact admirably doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that So much more interesting food for discussion later.